Hello, this is Thelma English. Nice to see you again. Brit Lit Survey, Session 7. I hope you are enjoying Canterbury Tales as much as I do every time I go through these. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for all these who are willing to do the tougher thing, the tougher, better thing, and home educate at home. I pray that you would bless these young men and women as they study English literature with me. And I pray that we could finish up this year feeling that we are better people, better Americans, better Christians, because we have studied more thoroughly. We pray that you bless this 2 hours that we have together. In Jesus' name, amen. Welcome back. It's always fun to study Canterbury Tales and to study British literature with you. I know that you have another couple of weeks to go with Canterbury Tales, but talk about fun. I hope you have had a great week. This, of course, is Chaucer's Prioress, the one who does not dress like someone that you would expect to be a prioress. She does have on that cloak and a black hood, but we know that she's wearing jewelry around her wrist instead of a rosary. It probably is a rosary, but she's replaced the cross with that capital A for amor, for the Latin love. And she is on page 107. We'll have some fun with some of these. It is time for our devotion, The Imitation of Christ. Whoever volunteered last week, would you please read your devotion now? And you'll need to pause this video. Okay, I hope you are enjoying The Imitation of Christ. I know that I read it outside of class also. And besides the Dover edition, I think I mentioned to you that you can buy a copy of this, The Imitation of Christ. You can buy a copy that's bound like a little Bible, sewn with a little ribbon bookmark. And if you like to go through different devotion books through the years, like I do, I read my Bible, but I do enjoy devotion books. And The Imitation of Christ is one of my favorites. I can open up that little book anywhere and find something that will lift me up. This is week 7. We're continuing in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We are not reading all of the tales. If you want to see what you are missing, you can go to a library and look at a complete volume or look online. It's all free online now. However, many of the tales are not really worthy of reading. There are some fabulous, there are some farce, there are some that are quite dirty jokes, lots of dirty jokes. And so I've carefully chosen these, and that's why I did not have you order the Dover edition. I printed these myself with a few footnotes. I realize it could be done better, but this is, I think, good enough for our class. We're going to be talking about the study guides a little bit, talking about the Middle Ages, talking about indulgences so that you know what those are, and talking about the Renaissance and the Reformation and what did that do with literature? What did that have to do with literature? You know that you're continuing in the Canterbury Tales, those pages 99 to 167. If you did not staple those together, you might try doing that. I do have a couple of emails prepared for you that your teacher or parent will share with you once you get going this week. And if you have some questions, especially on number 17 about the classical allusions, because there are quite a few, and that takes you a little bit of time to get used to what classical allusions are. The Knight's Tale, you know, is a chivalric romance. We talked about that last week. The setting is a medieval castle. So Chaucer's own day, a medieval castle. There are knights, there are towers, there are even tournaments, you know, for the hand of the beautiful lady. But instead of happening in medieval Europe somewhere, it's happening in ancient Athens. And so Chaucer's audience, a mediocre education in the Middle Ages would have been much better, of course, than what we have today. Education has really gone downhill, as long as you were being not out in the country somewhere where you weren't even going to school. So Chaucer had quite an education. All of his audience was familiar with all the classical tales, which means everything that surrounds the Iliad and Odyssey. That's what classical literature is. And then all of the Greek stories, the Greek tragedies specifically, and the Greek, even Socrates. So his audience would have been familiar with all of these classical things that took place 1200 years BC, 400 years BC, and here they are in AD 1385 or something, a couple thousand years from the Iliad and Odyssey, but they know all the stories. They have been translated, and the printing presses have printed some of these. They've learned these in school. So you're continuing this week to read in your syllabus. You're continuing to work on that reading. Read with a highlighter so that you get as much out of this as you can. This is the week you turn in your syllabus reading checklist. If you forgot it today, you can bring it next week. The one page that says sessions 1 to 31, reading checklist at the top. And this is what your parent is initialing each week to say you have done your syllabus reading. And you should have read up to page 99 at this point to get 100% credit in that grade slot for syllabus reading for Q1. Forgiveness for sale. This is hard for Protestants. Most of my students are Protestants, and this is really tough. Here's an indulgence. This one is dated in 1521, so 120 years after Chaucer, but the indulgences are still going on. It's made by a printing press. And medieval indulgences and Chaucer, what on earth is the connection between those two things? Well, indulgences depended on fear of an afterlife where people were punished for sins committed during their life on earth. They were believed to make the period of punishment in purgatory briefer. I'm using for my expert today, one of my experts is the Cambridge Guide to English Literature, which if you're going to be a lit major in college, you may as well just buy one. You can get them used all over the place. They could be granted, you could be granted an indulgence in return for prayers or other acts of penance, like going on a pilgrimage, for instance, to Canterbury to visit the shrine of the martyr Sir Thomas a Becket, St. Thomas a Becket. You could also say a number of Hail Marys and then give money. So the popes would publish lists of every kind of crime with a price for each sin. And then the church would give absolution, which means forgiveness from sins. So if you had been, for example, a knight, the knight on the way to Canterbury in our tale may very well have what we today would call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And he may be suffering greatly for some of the atrocities that he has committed. And this knight is going on a he's going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Maybe he wants to ask forgiveness. If he brings enough money, maybe he can donate money and buy an indulgence so that he feels like he won't have to be in purgatory. Yes, purgatory is a very Catholic thing. Protestants don't talk about purgatory. Protestants do believe that if you sin and are unforgiven and do not confess and accept Christ, that yes, you do go to hell. But we don't believe that there's an in-between place, and that if all of your relatives donate enough money and say enough prayers, that you can get rid of your time in the in-between place, or perhaps go to heaven instead of hell. So you can see how an authority, a religious authority figure in your life could really squeeze you for money, promising that that person that you don't know if they're saved or not might have a chance to get in heaven if you give enough money. So this is some tricky, really bad theology. But every sin had a price. You could donate and that would forgive you your sin. And you had to actually really be sorry. And you had to donate, and you had to say a lot of prayers. So going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, as Chaucer's pilgrims did, would lessen the time that a Christian spent in purgatory before they went to heaven. A German monk had angered Martin Luther enough to write his 95 Theses. Luther is quoting the monk when he's kind of getting angry and mad, and he's getting ready to write these theses, and he quotes the monk. So this is mocking. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. You can imagine selling indulgences with that little ditty. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. As soon as you put your money in the coffer, the bowl, the tin, the bucket, whatever, you're the soul you're praying for, that you're donating the money for, will be sprung right out of purgatory. And of course, a lot of people did not know proper theology. And so you can imagine the amount of money that they were able to raise. No one actually even knows how much. We're talking the millions, millions, millions. Reciting specific prayers like a Hail Mary was declared to reduce the time one spent in purgatory by a few days, or maybe hundreds or even thousands of years. But letters of indulgence depended on payment. Although for the indulgence to work, you still had to sincerely repent. Printed indulgences were ready-made receipts, and then they had a space left for the name of the purchasers. So this was incredible to not have to write this all out by hand, to be able to get it printed is the key word here, then fill in the blanks. The church, the universal church, which Catholic means universal. The universal Catholic Church used indulgences to raise money for specific purposes, although it was often debated how much of the money was actually spent that way. But popes would publish a list of all the crimes and what you could pay, the price for each sin, and then you could get absolution for that, forgiveness for that. The sale of indulgences was farmed out to pardoners, contractors, who would keep a portion of the takings as a payment. So our Chaucer's pardoner sold such indulgences. We read on page 1112 in our syllabus, as Chaucer's talking about the pardoner says, "From Rome, all hot," although it's not mentioned that he actually gave out written letters by way of receipt, as the one that we saw in the previous slide. But he's saying he's got these all hot, right off the press, hot. He has pardons ready to sell. And then he gets to keep a percentage of these pardons that he sells. And then you can imagine the opportunity, just like an IRS opportunity, the opportunity for theft and dishonesty is just enormous here. For the church, having indulgences printed saved from having to write each one out by hand. Compared with writing them out by hand, they could be produced really cheap and really fast. A printer could probably, an old-fashioned printing press, could probably produce nearly 1,000 a day from a single press. That's really good money. For the printer, this type of publishing would have provided a convenient daily or weekly income, especially in times when he had substantial sums tied up in the production of large books. You might wait months for production completion and payment of a large book like Canterbury Tale, but indulgences could be printed out just one order at a time. Caxton's first surviving indulgence that Caxton printed, excuse me, is from 1476, the same year in which he probably also finished the first edition of the Canterbury Tales. We don't know how many copies were printed of any of Caxton's indulgences, but we do know that a London institution that farmed out the sale of indulgences received payments corresponding to the sale of about $30,000 a year. Incredible amount of money. Despite the few surviving copies, indulgences may have played an important part in Caxton's financial success as a printer. Gutenberg of the famous Gutenberg press, also printed indulgences while he was producing his Bible in the 1450s. Anyone who was a printer, this was a way to make your weekly income, your weekly money. And as for there not being too many that have survived, I would guess that's something that somebody even maybe carried around with them. That would be a very important one, piece of paper. The tales were already established as a well-loved classic, and it seems a wise choice for Caxton to make this work the first big project for his English book production. He could sell indulgences for regular income while he worked on his great big project, the Canterbury Tales. Pope Leo X. Pope Leo X was part of the Medici family. If you get a chance to go to Italy, you will probably end up in Florence, and the main museum down there is the Academy, where Michelangelo's David is, and the Uffizi Museum, which has tons of artwork. And then you can visit some of the, I think there's one great big grand residence, we didn't go in there, of the Medici family. Like, he was an extravagant son of a notorious Renaissance family, Giovanni de' Medici. He was made a cardinal by the age of 13 years old and became Pope Leo X at 38. A pope gets to choose their name. So he went from being Giovanni de' Medici, and he's called the prodigal pope. And the Indulgences, that's the way you can earn quick money. He's been described as a polished Renaissance prince and a devious and double-tongued politician, and he is a pope. He was pleasure-loving, easygoing. He went on a wild spending spree as soon as he ascended the papal throne. So as soon as he became a pope, he started spending a lot of money. Expenses for his coronation festivities alone cost 100,000 ducats, 1/7 of the entire reserve Pope Julius had left in the papal treasury. So he got in there and spent 1/7 of all of the money just for his coronation ceremony. Leo's plans for rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, supposedly called St. Peter's because supposedly it's built where Peter is buried, and he may very well be underneath that building. There certainly is a first century body there. There's no way to prove that it's St. Peter, but that's another story in another class, and there are books written about that. So he wanted to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, and it was estimated that his plans would cost over 1 million ducats. Within 2 years as a pope, Leo had squandered the fortune led by his predecessor and was in serious financial embarrassment. So here he is 2 years into it. He spent so much money that he's broke. Now what's he going to do? I've got a few pictures I was able to find of different items the Medicis collected. It's not all paintings, all types of art and sculpture and everything that they collected. To keep up with his expenditures, his officials created more than 2,000 saleable church offices during his reign. So if you wanted an office, you could buy it. That would be the equivalent of becoming a House of Representatives or a senator by just buying your office. And of course, sometimes we say that they have bought their office. Some large donor spends so much money on advertising that they get them into office, and then they are expected to bow to the desires of that large donor. That would be buying an office. But here they were just creating church offices, and you could buy them. So people would donate money so that they could have a place in that chain of hierarchy. The estimated total profits from such offices have been estimated at 3 million ducats, but still that was not enough for Pope Leo X. The sale of indulgences provided the Pope with yet another source of income to pay for St. Peter's, to offset the costs of a war, and to enable a young noble to pay for 3 offices to which Leo had appointed him. The Pope issued an indulgence for a special sale in Germany. And this is our connection with Martin Luther. They're for sale in Germany, and Martin Luther is not happy. A Dominican monk, Johann Tetzel, was given the task of promotion. Luther reacted with his theses, and the rest, as they say, is just history. Christianity Today had a great article on this in issue 34. You can buy those Christianity Today. You can buy back issues. You can look up online and see the topic you're interested, find the issues that they have, and order those issues used. I do that all the time when I was building classes. Caxton printed most of his books in English. While that might seem obvious to you and me, it was unusual in the 15th century. That's the 1400s. Caxton focused his own production on the local market, importing books in Latin, but not exporting his own books to Europe. A book printed in English could not be expected to find readers abroad, because remember, like we mentioned in our last lesson, real books were printed in Latin or French. And here's a cool, this is St. John, and it's what do they call that when they carve it into wood and then they can press it to make an image? It's a woodcut. The recall of the histories of Troy. It's interesting to note, especially for those of you familiar with classical literature, the ancient Greek and Roman stuff. So Iliad and Odyssey of Homer, and then Greek tragedies, Plato, Socrates. So those of you familiar with classical literature, the first book that Caxton produced in the Low Countries was called The Recall of the Histories of Troy, or, remembering the history of Troy. Translated by himself, it said, from the French original. Now, so Caxton is selling this recall of the history of Troy, saying he has translated it from the French original. But of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in ancient Greek. not French. So it gets a little bit funny as you get into history a little bit more. But Iliad and Odyssey, don't get mixed up. They were written in Greek. The book is a collection of stories very loosely. We could capitalize very and loosely, very loosely based on the tales of the Trojan Wars. For all of early history, the Trojan War was the only topic for poetry. The Trojan War, Iliad and Odyssey, those stories, those were the only topics that people even thought of for poetry for hundreds and hundreds of years. Caxton aimed for a court readership. He wants the educated people all locked up in those newly built castles from 400 years ago. That would be newly built. Here in America, that's all the history we have. But in Europe, 400 years is not much. So he aims for a court readership. Stories of war, as long as they have a lot of women, knightly exploits, and love were popular courtly reading, right? All of those people locked up in the court, the women, the daughters, the children, they all want to hear these stories. And this is how it all happens. Now, our Canterbury pilgrims are traveling from London all the way to Kent. So you can see we're becoming more familiar with this little area of Britain. You can see in the middle right, you can see Canterbury. That's where the cathedral is. That's where St. Thomas a Becket was martyred. And you can see Dover. You saw pictures of Dover last week. The White Cliffs of Dover, that's where the World War II crossing the English Channel took place. We went and took down all of those big cement things to let the boats come into those 5 different beaches. You're familiar with Hastings down in the south. The Battle of Hastings was right there. And you're familiar with whatever. The Thames, it looks like Thames, but the British pronounce it the Thames River, which kind of separates London. They have little bridges all over around in London. So our pilgrims are meeting in Southwark, London, and they're going to go all the way down into Kent and past to Canterbury. But we're looking at just London to Kent right now for a little story from our book publisher. Caxton told a story of some merchants going down the Thames River in London. There was no sailing wind, so they landed on the Kent side of the river to buy wood. Okay, so they left in London. You can see London there. They left from London. I don't know if you can see my little cursor. I think you can. And they're going down the Thames, and there's no wind for sailing. And so they get off in Kent. They get off in Kent because they need to buy some things. And now we have Caxton's words himself. Here's the first paragraph, and this is how Caxton spells. And I'm going to try to imitate the way he talked, but I'm sure I'm slaughtering it. So if we do have any medieval specialist or English specialist who happen to get hold of this, you just have to forgive my pronunciation. So this is Caxton's words. They'd stopped the boat and they've stopped to buy food. And specially, he asked after eggies. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. So he says, do you have any eggies? And Lily says, I don't speak French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would had eggies, and she understood him not. And then, alas, another said that he would have an errand. Then the good wife said that she understood him well. So he says, I want some eggies. And she says, I don't speak French. And he gets mad because he doesn't speak French either, but she couldn't understand him. Oh, as a translator of books that were to be printed, Caxton had to ensure that the language which he used for the printing, for the words themselves, was acceptable to quite a wide group of potential readers and buyers. Remember, there's no dictionary. And people aren't learning English in school, they're just learning it from their parents. Lou, what should a man of these days and now write it? Eggies or Aaron? Certainly, it is hard to please every man because of diversity and the change of language. So what's he saying? Oh my goodness, what should a man of these days now write? When I write the word eggs, how should I write it? Eggies or Aaron? Because certainly it's hard to please every man by cause of diversity, because everybody's different and the change of language. So Caxton has a quandary. How is he going to spell these words so that everybody will know what he is writing. As far as the social position of his language was concerned, Caxton's solution was to strike what he perceived as a balance, but he aimed his language not at rude common men, but at a clerk and a noble gentleman. He wants to get the middle of the road people who are more likely to read this. Excuse me, middle of the road. Paragraph 3. And you should have this printed as a handout. Therefore, in a mean between, both I have reduced and translated this same book into our English, not over rude nor curious, but in some terms that I shall understand them by God's grace. So, therefore, as a compromise, he says, in a mean between, both I, so as a compromise, I've translated this book, this said book, into English, which is neither too coarse, not over rude, too coarse, or curious, too coarse, or too refined, but using phrases that are understandable, God willing. I get a kick out of that. While his English was clearly based on the emerging standard language of London, Caxton's approach to spelling does not constitute any kind of an attempt to create a standard. His spelling varies widely within each book, and even more from book to book. This is a real difficulty in the 1400s, Before dictionaries, this is a real difficulty because language varies too much, and there is no standard. Without a standard, how do you know what to do? It's just like morals. Without a standard, each person has to guess how they're supposed to live. And without a dictionary, each person guesses how to write some words. Some of us wish we could just write the words out as they sound. A standard English language would have been much more important to Caxton, a publisher of printed books, than to a scribe who produced one copy at a time. If even people in nearby Kent found the language of London as alien as if it were French, this was a serious issue. This is only maybe 50 or 60 miles. You've traveled this far in a boat, and do you think the other people are speaking French? They're speaking so differently than you are. This is a serious issue, especially if you want to sell books broadly. There was a Europe-wide norm for books in Latin. Remember last week, those were considered real books. Latin was standardized, which made it possible for the printed book to become a successful international merchandise because everyone used Latin. Achieving a linguistic norm for the vernacular English was of economic importance for the distribution of Caxton's books. And he was evidently aware of this, but he didn't have the background to create a new norm. And that's why words are spelled differently from book to book and even inside the book. At best, his English printed books helped to consolidate a growing perception that the language used in the London region was a nationwide standard, English. But Caxton himself did not create the nationwide standard English. For this, we must give credit to Chaucer and to Wycliffe. So Caxton tried to type it out, but Chaucer and Wycliffe get the credit for creating this English that we call Middle English. The Canterbury Tales begins with a prologue. In the prologue itself, which we looked at last week, Chaucer gives us the fullest, most varied, and the liveliest panorama of men and women in medieval literature. When the wife of Bath expresses her opinion of marriage, they may be hers alone, but they may reflect the new growing revolt against the established doctrine and represent the new growing faith in human reason, which really is the definition of the Renaissance spirit, faith in human reason. You simply trust what you think. Rather than looking to the Bible for all of your advice, you have faith in your human reasoning, and that is the Renaissance spirit. Chaucer is an artist with no interest in your soul. He really doesn't care where you go after you die. His interest, like Petrarch's poetry and Boccaccio's Decameron, which was 100 stories, probably what Chaucer is copying, but Boccaccio didn't finish his Decameron and Chaucer didn't finish his Canterbury Tales, but it's all in the here and now. Boccaccio was 100 years earlier than Chaucer. Chaucer Petrarch was right in that same period. They were both early humanists. Their stories were just for fun. They were not church stories to get you to repent and change your ways. We see a microcosm of medieval life. Here's the Miller, just a colorized version that's touched up a little bit from those, the copies that we used from the Ellesmere manuscript. But the Miller is described in our syllabus on page 110, and we're not going to read the Miller's Tale. It's really full of dirty jokes. The pilgrims are described so vividly that some have tried to trace back to find out who each one was. Was that a particular person in a particular town? The prologue is a series of character sketches of men and women from all over medieval Europe. I happen to personally think that even if Chaucer did have a person in mind, that he would not have painted them as they were, that he would have greatly exaggerated and changed it enough that it wouldn't be about that person anyway. The Knight's Tale is a chivalric romance. The knight gets to speak first. He's the highest one on the chain, and he is chosen to tell the first tale. The setting is a medieval castle, so 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, but there are tournaments, which we would expect, knights, towers, but it's all in ancient Athens. Medieval elements and classical pagan elements are intertwined to weave the story. It uses meter and rhyme. In fact, it uses iambic pentameter, which is 5 metrical feet, and each of those feet has 2 syllables. If we were reading it in the Middle English, it would read something like, my sample I usually use is from Shakespeare's Macbeth, the moon is down, I cannot see the clock. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 syllables divided into 5 metrical feet. And this is Chaucer developing this, what we call a heroic couplet, if you use 2 lines of it together. Very often, Shakespeare would use 2 lines of iambic pentameter to end a scene. And that way the people waiting off stage, because they didn't have a red light and a green light for the actors, but they would hear that rhyming couplet, the moon is down, I cannot see the clock, and whatever the following line would be. But you hear that rhyming couplet and you realize, oh, something's happened. This is the very end of this scene. And Chaucer is the one who created this. I flipped through, excuse me. Syllabus page 114 to 131 is the Knight's Tale. Don't look for the rhyming couplets, because this translator has attempted to do this with some poetry. We can go to page 114 and take a look at his tale, the Knight's Tale, where he starts. Syllabus page 114. And he does, this translator has tried to make it metrical, but the problem is sometimes you squeeze the words so hard to make each line 10 syllables with 5 metrical feet of 2 syllables each that you may change the story a little bit or make it harder to understand. But I've still chosen this because I like the meter, and because this is a free translation, no copyrights. Once on a time, as old tales tell to us, there was a duke whose name was Theseus. Of Athens, Greece, he was lord and governor, and in his time was such a conqueror that greater was there not beneath the sun. Full many a rich country he had won. With what his wisdom and his chivalry, he gained the realm of femininity. That was of old time known as Scythia. There wedded he the queen Hippolyta. And Hippolyta has a little sister, Emily, and brought her home with him to his country in glory great and with great pageantry, and to her younger sister Emily, and thus in victory and with melody, let I this noble duke to Athens ride, with all his armed host marching at his side. And truly, were it not too long to hear, I would have told you fully how that year was gained the realm of femininity by Theseus and by his chivalry, and all of the great battle that was wrought, where Amazons and the Athenians fought, and how was wooed and won Hippolyta, that fair and hardy queen of Scythia, and of the feast was made at their wedding, and of the tempest at their homecoming. But all of that I must now forbear. I have, God knows, a large field for my share, and weak the oxen and the soil is tough. The remnant of the tale is long enough. I will not hinder any in my turn. Let each man tell his tale until we learn which of us the most deserves to win. So where I stopped again, I'll now begin. And then he starts talking in line 35 on syllabus page 114. Now he starts actually telling about this Knight's Tale. He just gave us kind of the prologue to the Knight's Tale. And now line 35, he starts telling the story of the two knights locked in a tower. But you can see how writing this metrically certainly makes it easier for someone to read and to recite, and more fun to listen to. Chaucer used classical allusions extensively. We tend to think that authors have always used classical allusions, but Chaucer was the first one to do that. If you struggle finding classical elements in the Knight's Tale, please consult the email, or if the email was made into a handout prepared for that purpose. So some facilitators, parents, teachers may print that email and just give it to you as a handout, and others may copy and paste that into an email and actually email that to you. But I've given you list and list and list. I've answered quite a few student questions that my students commonly ask me, and they ask the questions and I give the answers and give samples and examples and explain classical elements in the Knight's Tale. So you must understand that those handouts are collections of emails. So don't expect them to be perfectly prepared, but they are the equivalent of getting an email from me right when you need it this week. The Prioress's Tale is a medieval saint's tale in rhyme rural. There are 7 long stanzas. A medieval saint's tale, well, that's what the Prioress's Tale is. It's a tale about a saint, and it's a little boy. I believe I mentioned this last week, a little boy who gets lost in the Jewish section of town, and they cut his throat and throw his body down into a ditch, and he miraculously sings when they find his body. It displays an underlying attitude of hatred between Christians and Jews, just like we see in The Merchant of Venice. If you have taken Shakespeare from me, you understand that we continue to read Merchant of Venice because we need to understand Chaucer had probably never met a Jewish person. Shakespeare had probably never met a Jewish person. They had been banned hundreds of years before Shakespeare from all of Europe, and Jews that were there had to live pretty much in hiding. They often would be money lenders. They were commonly known for lending money, but they were hated. It was a medieval understanding that the Jews had crucified Christ, not you and I Protestants. But the Jews had done that. And of course, everybody likes to blame somebody else. And that's extremely horrible theology. Edward I, also called Edward Longshanks, who's really long-legged, I think he's 6'2". Edward I had expelled all the Jews in 1290. So Chaucer and probably Shakespeare too had never even met a Jew. This is in your syllabus, pages 132 to 134. So if you go to page 132 in your syllabus right now, 132, and in the middle of the first, the first column, it says the Prioress's prologue. Each of these stories has a prologue and then the tale. And you've got the prologue down in the middle of the first column. We see it says the Prioress's tale. And this does reflect a very typical anti-Semitic bias. Semitic is a word that means Jewish. Semitic comes from the name of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Semitic people are Shem's people. That's where the word Semitic comes from. So if you are anti-Semitic, it means you are anti-Jew. You don't like Jews. And that was very common in Europe. So we read, O Lord, our Lord, thy name, how marvelous, is spread through all this mighty world, said she. For not alone thy praise so glorious is given by men of worth and dignity, but from the mouths of children thy bounty is hid, yea, even sucklings at the breast, the little infants nursing, do sometimes thy laudation manifest. Laudation is praise. We give thee laud, we sing at Christmas time. And we're going to read about the little boy, little 7-year-old choir boy, a widow's son, in the second column on syllabus page 132. The second column right about in the middle, about an inch above your hole punch, the middle hole punch. Among these children was a widow's son, a little choir boy 7 years of age, who went to school as days passed one by one, and who, whenever he saw the image of Jesus's mother, it was his usage, as he'd been taught, to kneel down there and say Ave Maria ere he went his way, before he went his way. Next stanza. Thus, and they are, you'll see there 7 stanzas. This is rhyme royal. Each of these little paragraphs is a rhyme royal 7-line stanza. Thus had this widow her small son well taught, our blessed Lady, Jesus' mother dear, to worship always, and he ne'er forgot. For simple child learns easily and clear. But ever when I muse on matters here, St. Nicholas stands I in my presence, for he, when young, did do Christ reverence. This little child, the next stanza, this little child, his little lesson learning, sat at his primer in the school, and there, while boys were taught, the antiphons kept turning, and heard the Alma Redemptus fair. So the prioress asks the Virgin Mary to be her muse. This would be very classical and pagan. Homer always asked the muses to inspire him and help him tell his story. And so the Chaucer here is asking Mary for help to know what to say. He knew not what this Latin meant to say, being so young and of such tender age, but once a young school comrade did he pray to expound to him the song in his language, because they'd been saying this in Latin, or tell him why the song was in usage, asking the boy the meaning of the song. On his bare knees he begged him well along. His fellow was an older lad than he, and answered thus, this song, as I've heard say, was made to praise our blessed Lady free, her to salute, and ever her to pray. So this older boy taught the Latin song to the little boy. The older boy knows what it means. And the song is what you're supposed to sing when you are dying, this Ave Maria. And of course, the little boy is singing the song after his throat is cut. And that's going to be the miracle here in the story. So continuing on to page 133, from the bottom of 132 to 133, her to salute and ever her to pray, top of 133, to be our help when comes our dying day. And that's the key to this story. I can't expound to you only so far. I've learned the song. I know but small grammar. Is this song made in all reverence of Jesus's mother? Asked this innocent. Now truly I will work with diligence to learn it all ere Christmas sacrament. So the little boy wants to learn this song before Christmas morning communion. He wants to know what it means. Though for the primer I take punishment, so even if he doesn't do his regular work, and though I'm beaten thrice within the hour, yet will I learn it by Our Lady's power. So Mother Mary will help him. His fellow taught him on their homeward way until he learned the antiphon by rote, till he had it memorized by rote. Then clear and bold he sang it day by day, each word according with its proper note. And twice each day it welled out from his throat, as schoolward went he, and as homeward went. On Jesus's mother was his fixed intent. So he sings it on the way to school and on the way home from school. As I have said, and here you darken the room, as I have said, as through the Jewry went, so he has to go through the Jewish section of town, as through the Jewry went, this little schoolboy, out the song would ring, and joyously the notes he sent upward, O Alma Redemptoris would he sing. To his heart's core it did the sweetness bring of Christ's dear mother, and to her to pray, he could not keep from singing on his way. Our primal foe, the serpent Satan, who has in Jewish heart his hornet's nest, so the hornet's nest of Satan is in the Jews, swelled arrogantly, O Jewish folks, alas, is it to you a good thing and the best that such a boy walks here without protest, in your despite and doing such offense against the teachings that you reverence? So supposedly Satan is stirring up the Jews here, angry that this boy, do you know that this boy walks through your town on the way to and from school, or your section of town? From that time forth, the Jewish folk conspire. This is evil, wicked people rubbing their hands together, that Chaucer's painting and picture. Out of the world, this innocent to chase. A murderer they found and hired. So now they've hired a hitman, who in an alley had a hiding place. And as the child went by at sober pace, this cursed Jew did seize and hold him fast, and cut his throat, and in a pit him cast. Okay, so he's got his throat cut. And you're going to find that then the widow is later on this same page in column 2, the widow is going to find her son, and the little dead boy is going to sing, and They carry away the dead boy. I think he's still singing as they carry him away. And then we read about the second Rachel carry the bier. The bier is the funeral bier, a cot you would carry him on. Second Rachel, this is Rachel weeping for her children in reference to the slaughter of the innocents of Herod killing all of the young males. Okay, let's go forward. That's a lot of time on one side, but I wanted you to realize the very crux of that story. And it is a precious story. If you have some Jewish heritage or Jewish friends, I'm really sorry that the Jews always suffer like this from writers. But that's why we learn history. The Nun's Priest Tale is a beast fable, kind of like Aesop's fable. But these are a beast fable, and you're going to learn all about Chanticleer. And this story is on pages 135 to 140. I hope you get a real kick out of this, the Nun's Priest Tale. So it's the Nun's Priest Tale. So the nun has a priest with her, and this is his tale. It's the Nun's Priest Tale, double possessive there, and it's a beast fable. So it's anthropomorphic. The chicken can talk. What else can I say? The chicken talks. And the lesson or the moral of Chanticleer is very clearly stated. Don't listen to flattery, and don't listen to your wife. That was good advice in the Middle Ages, according to Chaucer. And pay attention to your dreams. So, of course, this is all really bad advice. Don't listen to flattery. It's always a good idea. But Chanticleer, and you're going to see references to Chanticleer throughout the rest of English literature. Chaucer's Chanticleer is so beloved, and the little lessons learned from that of not listening to flattery, paying attention to your dreams, and silly things like that. So do enjoy this beast tale. The Pardoner's Tale is a sermon, and it has a very obvious moral. It's an allegory written in prose, so it's not metrical. Prose is the way you and I write. It's a short sermon. We don't read that one. The spirit of the Renaissance was the spirit of the classics. It was an attempt to revive that Hellenistic ideal. Hellene was supposedly the first Greek. That's a man's name, Hellene. And so Hellenism refers to anything that has to do with ancient Greece. It was a many-sided movement of the intellect and imagination for man's sake. It was a desire for liberty from the confines of medieval religion and the guilt from sin. That's what the Renaissance is all about. It is all about, we call the Renaissance a horizontal movement. It's a man's interaction with man, whereas the Reformation is very much a vertical movement. It is all about man's relationship with God, reading God's word for yourself, having that relationship with God through Jesus. It's a very vertical relationship. But the Renaissance is really the opposite. It appealed to the old man for satisfaction and for completion of human character. This is the top part of Michelangelo's David at the Academy in Florence, Italy, if you ever get there. Wycliffe's English Bible, I was able to find one picture from the British Library, of course. If you have not visited the British Library's website yet, you are in for a treat. You can even turn the pages on many of their books online. So if you have a laptop or something you can curl up with, go to look at the British Library and just take a look at what they have. This is Wycliffe's English Bible. It's quite small, from AD 1382. Remember, this is the same time as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Most of these were burned. And so it's really a miracle that some survive. The church had always kept man's sin in the forefront. The church didn't talk about man following his own reason, because what happens if we follow our own reason? We all know what that is. The church has always kept man's sin in the forefront. We have to ask forgiveness of sin. We need redemption. And what always comes to mind for me is 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. This is what the church always kept in the forefront. We are sinners, we need forgiveness. This new humanistic movement of the Renaissance was looking for release from that narrow way of living. People really don't want to listen to the Bible. Man would no longer concentrate on the distant horizon, Christian spiritual perfection, the end of his life and its reward or the consequences. He would focus in on the here and now, the pursuit of happiness and learning. And I do believe that Renaissance thought has just followed us all the way into today. That would be a very modern idea also, that you concentrate on today. You don't worry about the end of your life. In fact, you try to live as long as you can, and you try to look young forever and all of that. Man's spirit would not be self-conscious, answering to the old moral confines in the Bible. Many people then, just as today, found that the confines of the Bible was just too narrow for them. They didn't really want God telling them what to do and what not to do, or what is right and wrong. And of course, we see that today. The Renaissance was a reawakening of human reason and belief in the dignity of man. It was a desire for beauty, for liberty, sensuousness, and a desire for learning. The Renaissance spirit is always associated with the spirit of the classics, paganism, and mythology of the ancient Greeks and Romans. They always say that Mona Lisa it's not that I'm saying it's pagan, but the Mona Lisa really represents that Renaissance spirit of just beauty and art for art's sake. We're not learning a Bible study looking at this. We're just admiring this portrait. And this portrait lives at the Louvre in Paris. And good luck getting closer than about 10 feet to see that. At this time, Renaissance men in Southern Europe turned away from God and they turned inward to themselves. And we see what John talked about. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the spirit gives birth to spirit. Meanwhile, the reformers in Northern Europe were working towards bringing the scriptures to the people in their own language. Because the word of God is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword. What does the word do? Pierces to the division of our soul and spirit, our joints and marrow, and it discerns our thoughts and the intentions of our heart. That's Hebrews 4:12. So typical medieval art is either Renaissance or Reformation art. So it's either all about the pagan gods and goddesses, which they're almost always naked, perfect human samples, they're the gods and goddesses, or it's their Bible stories, which very often has naked babies. And generally, Jesus usually has a little halo over his head so that you know for sure that's Jesus. These thinkers took two paths that promised freedom, light, and wisdom. Each path was a back to the basics movement. It was the same impulse, but in two directions. And this is coming from that kind professor, Dr. Jan Haluska, who was he was the chair of English at Southern Adventist University. He is now deceased, but he corresponded with me for several years and helped me along with my studies of British literature. And he says each of these paths, the Renaissance and the Reformation, was a back to the basics movement. The same kind of impulse, but two different directions. One impulse toward man and one impulse back to God with the Bible in our own language. Wycliffe was a contemporary of Chaucer. That means they lived at the same time. Remember, Wycliffe and later Tyndale's translations, Gutenberg's press, Caxton's printing shop, and Chaucer's tales would develop the national language of English. And you need to remember, Wycliffe, Chaucer, Tyndale, primarily Wycliffe and Tyndale. The blending of the pagan thought with Christian thought resulted in an intellectual movement that removed the personal relationship factor. You just quit talking about God. There are three periods in Chaucer's writing that we will discuss just for a short period of time here today. Each is reflecting the wave of change progressing through literature. So the first period in Chaucer's writing is the French love poets, the earliest period of these French love poets. And we don't have time to study these. If you do French as a language, you might try to indulge yourself and read a little bit of his poetry. It would include the House of Fame and the Book of the Duchess. His Italian period, that during this time we see influence from Dante. Think of Dante's Inferno, Petrarch and Boccaccio, and we'll also only just barely mention this period. Chaucer's English period is the one we are interested in and the one we will concentrate on, because this is how Middle English gets created, when Chaucer's coming to his own. And this is the time of the Canterbury Tales. This is the time in which English finally becomes acceptable in all social circles. You don't have to use Latin or French anymore. You can use English. Not just the conquered, the people, but the conquerors also are going to be speaking this English. In Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, it's kind of like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, except it's more dirty. Cresside's uncle kind of panderous, that's where we get our word, pander, kind of sells his niece. These are the Greeks and the Trojans during the time of the Trojan War, and Pandarus is selling his niece to the other side. So it's kind of it's a dirty story. That's why I always call it Romeo and Juliet, but dirtier. This marks the beginning of a new literary era. This House of Fame that he printed, Troilus and Cressida, or Cresside, which Shakespeare would later borrow and then write about. And the Knight's Tale, these is Art Chaucer borrowed from Boccaccio, the guy who came before him. And there wasn't the idea of plagiarism. In fact, it was thought to be complementary if someone borrowed your work and redid it. This Troilus is based on that Trojan myth cycle. And I do call it the dirty Romeo and Juliet. If you wonder why I don't teach Romeo and Juliet, many people think that's the standard for young teens in high school, but Romeo and Juliet happens, if you take Shakespeare from me, you have it in the little cartoon tales, but Romeo and Juliet, two young people who marry against the will of their parents, run away and then commit double suicide. And that does not seem to be good story material to me for ages 14 to 18. I think that's better left for another time. I think teachers just presume that teenagers would like to read stories of teenagers rebelling against their parents, running away, and this very romanticized notion of committing double suicide so you can be together forever in death. The Knight's Tale, recounting the story of Arcady and Palamon, is also the subject of Shakespeare and John Fletcher's project they worked on that's called The Two Noble Kinsmen, which you can read on your own if you want to. The Clerk's Tale is from Petrarch. Chaucer got the tale of the patient Griselda in The Clerk's Tale, and we're not reading that. It's quite long. You could read it. He's very, very cruel to her, trying to prove whether she's faithful or not, because he's married to a beautiful woman. And of course, she's not only beautiful, she's extremely faithful. And he even has her to the time where she's at the end of the story, where he has her cooking the feast for his next wedding. Petrarch got this story from Boccaccio. It's the 10th tale on the 10th day in the Decameron by Boccaccio. And Boccaccio seems to have borrowed it from an even earlier old folk tale. And Giselle is always the name of some fantastic, amazing woman. Chaucer used classical allusions extensively, as you're going to see in The Knight's Tale. For example, if they're going to fight, the guys will go into the Temple of Mars. And of course, the Temple of Mars would be from the ancient Greek Roman days, not from medieval Europe. A Temple of Mars, by the time you get into the medieval days, you have cathedrals. You go into a cathedral to pray. But the guys, because they're going to war, they go into the Temple of Mars, and Mars is god of war. So that would be appropriate for them to go into the Temple of Mars and pray. And then poor Amelia, or Emily, however it gets printed in different copies, poor Emily, it goes into the temple of the chaste sister who never marries and carries the arrows and rides a little thing drawn by deer. I shouldn't put it unless it's in a slide. Diana's temple. Romans called her Diana, and the Greeks called her Artemis. And of course, she goes into, I think they call it Diana's temple. I don't think they use the word Artemis, but she goes into Artemis or Diana's temple because Diana's a virgin goddess, and prays because she doesn't want to marry either one of them. They're going to fight for her, and she just doesn't want to get married. Now, we might take it for granted that English poetry always had classical allusions, but it didn't. Before Chaucer, there were very few classical allusions in literature. The Green Knight, and that's coming up for us in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is an anonymous author, but he was apparently a contemporary of Chaucer. The metaphors and references are about Adam and Eve, Samson and Delilah, and David and Bathsheba. What does that call to mind? So the author of the Green Knight, his metaphors are all biblical metaphors, and Chaucer's metaphors are classical metaphors. Interesting, isn't it? Was the Gawain poet unfamiliar with classical mythology, the Iliad and Odyssey, all those stories, or did he deem it unworthy as unchristian? It was not because the material was unknown. French and Latin poets made profuse use of mythological allusions. The greater part of English poetry for Chaucer, at least that which has survived, was either historical, fake historical, or religious. It was conceived in moral earnestness and begotten of fact, or the supposed fact, and It thus had but slight interest in fiction, least of all the pagan fictions of Greece and Rome. Chaucer's willingness to appreciate and take advantage of the classics enabled him to use them as no English poet had done before. The use of classical material for moral or aesthetic purposes is a Renaissance thing. This new learning, but it wasn't. This Renaissance, which was new learning, was really turning back to ancient Greece and Rome. Interesting, isn't it? It's part of that process by which culture came to have a broader basis than the Bible and the Christian writers alone, and by which men acquired an interest in all things human and not merely in those that pertain to medieval Christianity. The spirit was the spirit of the classics, the Greek and Roman stuff, from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where the war took place about 1200 BC, through Greek tragedy, 400 BC, all the way up until almost the time of Christ. So it's an attempt. The Renaissance is an attempt to resurrect all of those Hellenistic ideals. It was a many-sided movement of the intellect and imagination for man's sake. Nothing about it is to glorify God. It's all for man's sake. It was a desire for liberty from the confines of medieval religion and to be free from the guilt of sin. People are always trying to be free from the guilt of sin. We see that rampant in our world today in 2022. People are trying to say the Christians are the ones who make you feel guilty. You don't have to live like what a Christian says. You shouldn't have to feel guilt if you're homosexual. You shouldn't have to feel guilt if you want to chop yourself up to try to be a woman or to be a man. You shouldn't feel guilt if you don't want to have your baby and you want to kill your baby in the womb. That's all from Christianity, that Christianity has brought all of this guilt. And of course, that's really inside us. We are really born knowing some right from wrong things. Everyone understands that to kill another is wrong. Everybody knows that basically, but we go to really long lengths to convince ourselves that that's not the case. The Renaissance spirit appeared to the old man that Romans 6:6 talked about for satisfaction and for completion of human character. The church had always kept man's sin right in the forefront with the need for redemption. Like Jesus told Nicodemus in the middle of the night when Nicodemus came to see him, and Jesus said, "You're the ruler of the religious ruler of the people and you don't know this?" And Jesus says, "You must be born again." The new humanistic movement was looking for release from that narrow way of living, the biblical way of living. The Renaissance focus was on physical beauty and fulfillment of physical perfection. And we see that rampant in today's world too. The worship of the body, the senses, the heart, the intelligence were all part of that Renaissance spirit. This focus is to fulfill man's baser needs, wants, and desires. Am I repeating this information? Yes, I'm trying to change the words up a little bit, trying to repeat it so that you understand what the Renaissance is. It's all about the here and now. With this ideal, realized man would be at unity with himself and with his physical nature, with the outward world. Man would no longer concentrate on that distant horizon, Christian spiritual perfection, the end of his life and its reward or consequences. He's going to start focusing on the here and now and the pursuit of happiness and learning. His spirit is not going to be self-conscious, answering to the old moral confines. They're getting rid of that. It was a reawakening of human reason and a belief in the dignity of man. It's a desire for beauty and liberty and sensuousness and learning. It's always associated with the spirit of the classics, paganism, and mythology. Yes, I realize this is a repeat, but it's because I want you to learn this. And if you don't know who this is, Oedipus here, answering of the famed Oedipus Rex, answering the Sphinx's riddle so that she will go away. And if you don't know the story, you'll just have to take classical lit. Eventually, I'll get that made into a class, possibly next year. At this time, Renaissance men in the South, they turn away from God. They turn inward. They're looking at themselves. Reformers in Northern Europe were working towards bringing the scriptures to the people in their own language. These thinkers took two paths that promised freedom, light, and wisdom. Each path was back to basics and the same impulse, but two directions. The reformers concentrate on Hebrew wisdom literature and New Testament writings, that reflect God's character and plan for us, while the Renaissance men search for truth within themselves. This blending of the pagan thought and Christian thought resulted in an intellectual movement that removed the personal relationship with God factor. Dr. Haluska once told me there were three categories of literature. There's the unworthy, the worthy, and then there is the eternal. Realizing the three characters snaps writers like Chaucer into clear focus. The greatness of that man, in part, is that he encompassed all three categories in his Canterbury Tales. The other part is that he invented English poetry after 1066 had changed the language forever. Using medieval forms, he presents his characters with a Renaissance clarity and often savage wit, while embracing Reformation ideals shocking for 1387 and other places, including Sola Scriptura, which could have gone and burned at the stake. He also includes some tales that border on the worthless, and we don't read those. He's a microcosm of the age all by himself. Courtly romance. This is one of the tales. We read the Knight's Tale, and there are other tales that are courtly romances. We do read the wife of, no, we don't read the wife of Bath's Tale. We read her prologue. We read the Fablio, the stuff you just shouldn't read, the Miller's Tale, really filthy, the Reeve's Tale, the Merchant's Tale, a Saint's Legend. We read one of those. We read the Prioress's Tale, and we read a Beast Fable. We read the Nun's Priest's Tale, all about Chanticleer, and we do read one sermon, the Parson's Tale. Shakespeare draws freely, later from Chaucer, but embellishes the stories with his 30,000 plus word vocabulary. I've read books that said he had a vocabulary of 40,000 words. I'm just choosing to be somewhat cautious here. And after another 150 years after Chaucer is going to usher in the heavy, formal, long philosophical new words that are all borrowed from Latin and Greek, assimilated during the Renaissance revival of pagan masterpieces. And those are the words that we see resurrected in science and medicine and legal terms. The first dictionary would not be far behind. Praise God. Thank you, Webster. The Renaissance and Reformation had presented new knowledge and new ideas, and that meant new words. There was a flood of new sciences, new worlds to explore, the new age, the Elizabethan age, Elizabeth I. Chaucer died AD 1400, convenient to remember. He's buried in Westminster Abbey. They just went through the ceremonies this week for Queen Elizabeth II to bury her somewhere there in Westminster Abbey. They had the ceremony there, and they're burying her in a private chapel somewhere near. But Chaucer was the first one to be buried in the Poet's Corner. Now there are more than 100. I found a couple of pictures for you of the Poet's Corner. If you look down in the lower left of this photo, you can see Chaucer's original, the original Chaucer monument, and then you see all of the others. There are more than 100, and now the artists include writers, songwriters, all types of different creative people. This is the memorial for C.S. Lewis, who died in 1963. He actually died on the same day as President Kennedy was assassinated, and or otherwise the world would have stopped for C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Isn't that a beautiful quote for C.S. Lewis? And of course, here's Shakespeare. Pretty cool, just for some fun. Thomas Eliot is buried there. Alfred Lord Tennyson is buried there. Henry James is buried there. Let's see, Dylan Thomas, lots of famous writers. Excuse me. And unfortunately, so many of these are on the floor. Charles Darwin is on the floor. And it's very hard for Americans because we're trained, you don't walk on graves. If you go to a graveyard to visit a relative's grave and put flowers there, you don't walk across the grave. You walk in between the graves on the grass. But the British they put them in the famous people in these abbeys, and they bury them under the floor. And their markers are here on the floor. And so you have to walk across them, and it kind of feels irreverent. Now, we're going to take a look at the English Bible, and we'll see if we can get through this. I think we can. In other years, we haven't been able to get this far to the English Bible because they have been live classes, and there's simply too many interruptions going on in a live class to press a crush of information. We look at the English Bible, the history, and we're talking about from 1500 BC, that would be Moses writing, all the way through to AD 1600, which would, well, I could say 1611, and that would include the King James Version of the Bible, where we step right into modern English. Believe it or not, King James English is modern English. Once you get to AD 1500, you cross over the threshold of Middle English and into modernity, modern history, modern English. And we're going to see that the Bible goes from Hebrew to Greek, and then from Greek to Latin, and then from Latin to English, and English is the big deal. In the 1440s BC, we know the Exodus was 1446, and immediately after the Exodus, we presume that Moses began writing. And we know they wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years, and we know that at the very end of that, Moses died. So from about 1446 to 1406, somewhere in there, we know that Moses compiled the Hebrew, what is called the Pentateuch, those first 5 books. I do happen to believe he's also functioning as God's editor and author, compiling any primary source records into one work as God directs him. That's not being a heretic. There are many books written on the subject, lots of ink spilled on this. Did Moses write Genesis? Did God just dictate it to him and he wrote it down? There do seem to be large chunks of Old Testament which are divided with little insertions of poetry. I took an entire class on this in seminary. I did exegetical theology in seminary, and there are entire books and sections of books written about this, that Moses may have been privy to have all of the previous collection of scrolls or whatever that the text was written on. He would be the one, the perfect man to put all of this together and then add what God gave him. So I do happen to believe that Moses probably just didn't close his eyes and God told him what to write for Genesis 1. I believe God may have done that, but it's also possible that Moses is compiling previous scrolls, but we can't go further than the 1440s BC with any certainty. It's all speculation and talk. Interesting talk, but talk. Now, that was 1446 BC. By the time we get to 586 BC, Judah, we know that there is, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and by 1100, by 1000 BC, they have a king. They have Saul, and then David and Solomon, and then the kingdom divides in 931 BC. If you took Old Testament survey, all these dates, you've even got these written down, you've got the whole syllabus, and these are hopefully in your brain forever. So 931 BC, Solomon dies, and then Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Rehoboam his son, and Jeroboam takes the northern 10 tribes, and Rehoboam takes the 2 tribes, and that becomes Judah, and Jerusalem happens to be in the southern kingdom, but it's the very northernest part of the southern kingdom. And so the northern kingdom is taken out in 722. The Assyrians come down and take them all and scatter them all over the world. And then all you have left is little Judah. And in 586 BC, Judah is taken into captivity and taken all the way to Babylon. You probably know from Jeremiah 25 that they go into Babylon for how long? 70 years. So Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonian king, and they're taken into captivity to Babylon, which is modern day Iraq. And the Babylonians speak Aramaic, or they spoke at that time, they spoke Aramaic. They remained in Babylon under the Medo-Persian Empire. So the Babylonians get taken over by, the Assyrians get taken over by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persians, basically Cyrus. And there they began to speak Aramaic. So they are in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And while they're in Babylon 70 years, the Babylon falls to Persia. So now there are Persians there. And it's this Persian king Cyrus that says, you can all go back home now. And if we have any of your cool stuff from the temple out in the shed out back, you can take it home with you and we'll help you rebuild your temple. But just remember that you pray for me also. And don't forget, we'll come around and collect the taxes. So they're speaking Aramaic. Now, many Jews, while they're there these 70 years, some of them come back, but most of them don't come back. They stay. How do Jews end up in Persia, in Iran today? Well, that's how. It's from a long time ago. And many, while they're living there in Persia, lose the ability to read and speak Hebrew, which is the language of their own sacred language, literature. So they come home. If they do come home, they can't read Hebrew anymore unless they were taught while they're in captivity, unless they had, Hebrew school. So about 275 BC, the 39 Hebrew Bible books get translated into Greek by 72 Jewish scholars. And so 72, Septuagint is 70, and LXX is also 70, and that's close enough. This is probably legendary. It's probably something similar like that, but supposedly it was done by these 72 Jewish scholars. I think 12 from each tribe, something like that. It couldn't have been 12 from each tribe. Anyway, by these Jewish scholars. It's the wrong class. Old Testament survey, I have it all memorized. And so it gets translated in Greek by the Jews. Now, completion of all the original Greek manuscripts that make up the 27 books in the New Testament is all done by the end of the 1st century. Regardless of what anybody else tells you, the Apostle John, who lived to be the oldest, died about AD 99, possibly AD 100. And when the Apostle John dies, that's the end of all the apostles. There are no more apostles writing things to be saved forever in the Bible. And that's the end of the apostolic age. This is a photo of Codex Sinaiticus from about the time of Jerome's Vulgate Latin Bible, which would be way back in the AD 330s. So this is from the AD 300s. And this codex is written in Greek. And of course, it lives in the British Library. As the centuries after the resurrection unfolded, the dominant language spoken in the Roman Empire began to change. No longer was Greek the dominant language. And so in AD 382, Pope Damascus commissioned Jerome. He said, go translate the Bible into Latin, because that's what everybody reads is Latin. And that's a task that took him 20 years to repeat. This Latin Bible came to be known as the Versa Vulgata, the common translation. And if you've taken Latin, and I'm slaughtering this, I apologize for that, and became the standard for the Western Church. In English, we call this Bible the Latin Vulgate. Some people call it the Vulgate, but it's Latin, the Latin Vulgate. This is Jerome in Bethlehem, where he learned Hebrew and translated from the Hebrew. Eusebius Hieronymus Sophronius, better known as Jerome, born sometime around AD 340 or 347, I see a typo with the AD, in what is now Italy. He received a classical education by age 18. He was baptized in Rome by Pope Liberius. He was well read in the pagan poets and writers, but wasn't interested originally in Christian literature as a young man. From 374 to 379, Jerome led an ascetic life as a hermit in the desert southwest of Antioch. And in 379, he got ordained to be a priest. His travels took him around the world. He went to Alexandria in Egypt, and finally he went to Bethlehem, where he settled to live in a monastery. There he translated the Old and New Testaments into Latin. That if you wonder why the Catholic Church had read from Latin until the 1970s, and some part of the Catholic Church still do, this is Jerome's Vulgate. This translation was recognized 11 centuries later by the Council of Trent as the official version of the Bible, the Vulgate. And that's why it's such a big deal in the Catholic Church. And that's why the Reformers were so hysterical about it, because they wanted to go back to the Greek and the Hebrew and then translate it into English so that people could read it for themselves. You don't get much out of Latin Bible reading. In AD 406, he completed his translation of the Bible into Latin, including his own translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew. So this is quite an accomplishment that Jerome did. This is only a few years. AD 410, I believe, is when St. Augustine died in Rome, literally as the Visigoths and the Vandals were breaking down the walls of the city of Rome. And they spoke with one another. They wrote back and forth to one another. And Augustine said, why would you want to learn that language of those filthy Jews? Remember the time period? Even by this time, the poor Jews had been vilified. And Augustine said, why would you want to learn that language? And Jerome wrote back to him basically and said, I'm an old man. Go argue with somebody else, somebody younger. The church history set records all of those letters, that massive set. Can't remember what it's called, but it's like 36 volumes. Of course, I have it on my shelf down the hall. Jerome's earliest translations of the Hebrew Bible were based on the Septuagint, so the Bible in Greek. However, about 393, he turned to manuscripts written in the original Hebrew. Augustine argued that by using Hebrew manuscripts, Jerome was driving a wedge between Christians of the East and West, because the Greek-speaking Christians of the East were using the Septuagint, the Greek version. Bede had translated the book of John into Old English, Anglo-Saxon English, but no copies have survived. We only know that he did it. By AD 600, Latin was the only language allowed for scripture. And that's why people would later get burned at the stake for trying to translate the Bible into English. The Anglo-Saxon translations around 8600 to 1150, we begin to see the Anglo-Saxon translations. And here, of course, this is the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6, 9 to 13, as given in the West Saxon Gospels, which is pretty cool. The language of Beowulf. John Wycliffe completed his translation directly from the Latin Vulgate into the vernacular Common English in the year 1382. It's now known as the Wycliffe Bible. Think of Wycliffe Bible translators. Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation. Big deal to have the Bible in English. Whereas Bede was made a saint, Wycliffe was declared a heretic by the Roman Catholic Church, primarily because he challenged the doctrine of substantiation and the papacy. The whole idea of having a pope, he challenged that. That's the papacy. Papal decree is something the Pope says. Transubstantiation is the idea that when you take communion, the priest lays the biscuit on your tongue, and it tastes like a biscuit, it looks like a biscuit, but it becomes the actual flesh of Christ. And when you drink the wine with grape juice in the Protestant church, then it tastes like grape juice, it looks like grape juice, but it actually becomes the blood of Christ. That's transubstantiation. And he challenged that. He said, Christ doesn't die over and over and over. That's the main difference between Protestants and Protestants and Catholics. From the Protestant perspective, however, we call him the morning star of the Reformation. And here, look at his lifetime, way back at the time of Chaucer. And so the morning star, he's the one who birthed the Reformation. In 1428, after Wycliffe was declared a heretic, they exhumed his body from consecrated ground, they burned it up, and then they threw the ashes into the river. Gutenberg then invents the printing press in AD 1455. This is only about 30 years before Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And so the printing press, this is absolutely a huge idea. This page happens to be from Psalm 8. The first book ever printed is Gutenberg's Bible in Latin. Books may now be mass-produced, of course, instead of individually handwritten after this time. AD 1516, Erasmus produces a Greek-Latin parallel New Testament, which is really cool, 500 years ago. In AD 1522, Martin Luther's German New Testament, made from Jerome's Vulgate, is produced. AD 1526, William Tyndale's New Testament, the first New Testament printed in the English language. Amazing, isn't it? The first New Testament printed in the English language by William Tyndale. William Tyndale would translate the New Testament from Greek to English for the first time. His translation was by far the most scholarly because he went back to the Greek, and all future translations were based largely upon his work. The Geneva Bible. This is just before the King James Bible, and a student gifted me with a Geneva Bible, and it is pretty easy to read. If you can read Shakespeare, if you can read the King James Version of the Bible, then you can go one step further back and you can read the Geneva Bible, and it's actually pretty cool. It's the first English language Bible to add, and this is a big deal, numbered verses to each chapter. That's only 500 years ago. Numbered verses to each chapter. What a thought. What a wonderful thought that the Geneva Bible editors had to number the verses so that we can all go to the same verse at the same time. And then, of course, a few years later, about 60 years later, in 1611, the King James Bible. King James, who came to the throne, Elizabeth I died in 1603. King James came to the throne. He was her nephew from Scotland, becomes a king of Scotland and England. He was not coronated in 1603 because a plague broke out. I think it took a couple of years. And Shakespeare wrote that play, Macbeth, specifically for King James, because James had this fascination with witchcrafts and telling people, stay away from witches. They're just there to ruin you, which is a pretty cruel theme, really, for a play like Macbeth. But that's another class. That's Shakespeare. But he did try to present a new translation of the Bible, a more modern translation than that 1560 Geneva Bible. So this is 51 years later. And he thought if he could bring a Bible out that maybe he'd become more popular. I don't think it really helped him much. From 1604 to 1611, 47 scholars worked on this translation, the King James Authorized Translation. It's worth reading the presentation pages inside a King James Bible just to read all the wonderful flowery things they say about King James for a couple of pages worth at least. And how awesome he is as king. Kind of the same type things that they've been saying about Queen Elizabeth II, who just passed on. They have all these flowery words that they, whenever they talk about her, that they use. Originally, it had all 80 books of the Old Testament, including those Apocrypha that now only Catholics have, and then the New Testament. The Apocrypha was officially removed in 1885, leaving only the 66 books in the King James Version of the Bible, which we have today. The New American Standard then came in 1971. This is a long time. Translations are a long time coming out. And then there's also an updated New American Standard Bible. When I was in seminary, 1999 to 2004, New American Standard was the only Bible you could use. The updated New American Standard Bible has red underlined text. The original has blue lines, blue lines below. When you see that New American Standard Bible, the original is shown on this slide in blue, and that has little lines through it. And the updated one has the red. So Exodus 15:7 changes from, "And in the greatness of thine excellence, thou dost overthrow those who rise up against thee. Thou dost send forth thy burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff." And in 1971, they updated this to say, "And in the greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff." That would be New American Standard, made some different changes. Then the NIV, published in 1973. This was absolutely huge. This is when I was a teenager. I did not make that switch from the King James Version, or the New King James Version as I was using when I was your age, to the NIV. It just took a little while to get really popular. But the NIV in 1973 has been incredible, and it has gone through all types of different shifts. There are presently, as they're printing it, they've made some changes that are theologically incorrect. And so you definitely need to get an earlier version of NIV. That's another class, and that's actually easy to find online now that you know it's a thing. The New King James Version, all that they have done is taken out the these and thous and things like that. So the New King James Version, if you like that, from 1982, is really good. The English Standard Version, put out in 2002. Everybody should get one of these. Even if it's not your primary Bible, you should get the ESV Study Bible. You can get a hardback copy for $25, and they go on sale on Amazon all the time. First put out in 2002, and they have incredible maps and charts and things that are using correct timetables, correct dates, lots and lots of scholarship. For a $25 book, it is, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches, maybe 4 inches thick. It's massive, so you might not want to carry that around, but it's really a bookshelf of resources. For example, about that Exodus date in 1446 BC, the Exodus, there are other people who claim for an earlier date of 1250 or 1220 BC, I believe. And in the ESV, when you get to Exodus chapters 12 to 14, they will send you to an essay that they've written in the back that talks about why people support the 1250 date BC for the Exodus and why people support the 1446. And then they lean their support toward the 1446. They simply believe it's the better date. And so you really get the best of scholarships, and you learn the arguments. And that's very important for us as Christians to understand that there are people who argument for these earlier dates, and basically that kind of wipes out the judges, but that's another class. That's Old Testament survey. So ESV really should have one on your bookshelf, even if it's just to have that library wealth of information and it's not your daily read. And if you have, I think it's a 6-figure item now, you can get a little Dead Sea Scroll fragment. You can get a little scrap for about $100,000. You could get one little scrap that was written 2, 3, 400 BC by somebody. And I put that in for a joke. This is Old Hebrew, so you have the letters are very slightly different if you've taken the Old Testament survey and learned Hebrew, but these here, this would be pretty easy to translate just that way. This is Nehemiah 3, 14, and 15, available for more than $100,000. And that is the end of today's presentation. I want you to have fun with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I'll let you look at this Dead Sea Scroll fragment for a minute. I want you to enjoy this. You do still have a couple of weeks before it's due. We'll talk about it more next week. Do take advantage of those emails, whether you've received them as emails or as handouts. And you might spend any time you have left in today's class talking about the questions that you have problems with. And I would suggest to your teacher, parent, facilitator that the younger the student, the more help they get. If you know where they are in their educational process, you can use your own judgment as far as determining how much help they need. If you help them a whole bunch, at least have them put this into their own language, into their own words, and use your own judgment. I think the parents know the best. Okay, the Lord bless you, and I will see you next week.